the beat of life. I want to do it. Educated and complicated. And we survive till it's too
Uncensored Radio Free America. Rick Adams is on.
Yes. Hey, welcome back. Amen. Another Monday, the beginning of another week. We are here tonight, ladies and gentlemen, and children of all ages. And I am your radio avenger, Rick Adams, the Paul Revere of Talk Radio. And yes, indeed, we are starting a brand new week with a lot of topics, a lot of current events, and a lot of alarming news and facts to give you. So buckle up your seatbelts. Be prepared to go on a very, very intense journey. As promised, you know, I said a few days ago and a couple of weeks ago when the name came up that we would get him on the program. And he's been a busy fella, and he's had a number of things going on, and finally, we managed to round him up, lasso him into the corner of the arena here at rbnlive.com. And, of course, he is our correspondent for the American Free Press, and that is none other than Michael Collins Piper. And hello to you, Mike Piper.
Rick, it's good to be back on the show. It's been some time, and I always enjoy it.
Well, needless to say, we feel likewise, and your name has come up. People have asked about you, and I said, well, haven't been able to get a hold of them lately, but we will. And tonight we'll spend a lot of time together talking about some things that you have written about recently in both the American Free Press and the Barnes Review publication, its sister publication. So we invite our listeners to jump aboard, get on the line, 800-313-9443. It's as simple as that. Mike Collins Piper will take your call, your questions, your comments on this very program, Uncensored Radio Free America. And, of course, Mike he's been with the American Free Press, of course, when it was the Spotlight years ago. I guess he's put in his time. Mike, you've been there a long time, huh?
Well, yeah, I always hasten to add, though, that American Free Press is a completely different publication from the Spotlight. Totally separate company, really a lot of new individuals involved, but we, those of us who are there right now, we all started off with the Spotlight till it was driven out of business. I started with the Spotlight basically part-time in 1980, so I was with the Spotlight from 1980 till 2001 when it was forced out of business, and then group of us started American Free Press.
Yeah, that's quite a story in itself. The attempts to silence you, and heaven knows what's coming in the future with this gang of criminals in control of Washington now. But, and I got news for you. I beat you. I've been reading the Spotlight since the early 1970s, I believe. So I've been doing it for about 32 years or so, and I haven't stopped reading this great publication, which is now one of our anchors. So you stay with us, Mike Piper, and we'll be with you, our callers, and some real controversial subjects tonight. Stay tuned. Uncensored Radio Free America continues right here on rbnlive.com. Spread the word and get your radio receivers ready. Rick Adams and his guest will return in a few moments. All righty, let's begin the program. Rick Adams here on Uncensored Radio Free America. Mike Collins Piper, very great writer, I think, for the American Free Press, and a contributor to the Barnes Review. For those of you who don't know, the Barnes Review, of course, has been around for a few years now. It is a scholarly journal, a journal which deals primarily with history and historical revisionism on subjects like the World War II era, Civil War, and so forth. And the Barnes Review is certainly on the net. B-A-R-N-E-S, Review, Barnes Review. And Mike Piper, you had what many will consider to be a pretty startling article in the current issue of the Barnes Review, My 1-Minute Membership in the John Birch Society. My.
Yeah, Rick, it's an article that it's been rattling around in my head for many, many years. I can really date it back to about 1976, so it took almost, 30 years to get the article published.
Well, I have to confess up front that I am not only a former member of the John Birch Society, but also was a chapter leader, a local, what they call chapter leader of the John Birch Society for a long time, and of course I really became disenchanted with some of the things that were going on, and I decided to drop my membership and drop my chapter in toto, and some of the others did likewise, too. And we'll get into that a little bit later as to why I did it, but first let me ask you, this article, this is like 30 years in the making, and tell us about why you wrote it and what you say in it.
Okay, well, first of all, I must tell people, who don't know who I am or don't know what I've written or anything, I have to say this, that, as I said earlier, I've been around in the patriotic movement a long time. Mm-hmm. I know probably most of the key leaders. Some of them are my personal friends. I have their private home telephone numbers. It's not like I'm some amateur coming out of the woodwork spouting off about something that I don't know about, okay?
Right.
And like I say, although I started working for Liberty Lobby in 1980, I was politicized very early, going back to about 1976, when I was only 16 years old. And, I'm a pretty thorough reader and researcher. I have basically about 10,000 books in my personal library on a wide variety of topics. I guess what I'm just trying to say is, to those who don't know me or know about me, I am pretty well read and pretty well connected.
Absolutely.
Okay, and I've written thousands and thousands of published articles in various publications, and not just including the Spotlight, American Free Press, and the Barnes Review, and I've been interviewed on hundreds of radio programs. So this is, I just want that background to be out there, to be very, very clear. Now,
sure.
And as I say, I have always, from the very beginning when I got politicized, thought of myself essentially as a conservative. I'm certainly anti-communist. Today I don't like that term conservative like I used to, but that's another debate for another time. But needless to say, back in 1976, when I first really heard of the John Birch Society, I thought, this sounds like an organization for me. Because what I read about the Birch Society, I thought, well, I certainly agree with a lot of its views, maybe not all of them, but I don't think there's really any particular group or organization that I necessarily agree with on every issue. So starting off on that basis, I was eager to investigate the John Birch Society at that time. And in my article, in the article that I wrote recently in the Barnes Review, I describe how I first came upon Birch Society material, and that... You
were like 16 years old.
I was 16 years old. I had read about the Birch Society. I had not gotten around to writing them a letter, but I'd been, going to the library, doing research, trying to find the names and addresses of conservative and patriotic organizations in the United States. And lo and behold, right there in my local library was a copy of American Opinion, which was the Birch Society's publication at that time.
Yeah, it started out by Robert Welch as one man's opinion.
Right, and there it was, right on the shelf. And I remember when I saw it, I recognized the title. And, frankly, it was kind of like a little boy picking up a copy of Playboy for the first time,
it's funny because it was almost prohibited in most libraries at the time.
Right, exactly.
Like Playboy.
And I knew that. I knew that American Opinion and the Birch Society were considered quite controversial. And there it was in my library. I didn't know how it got there, but I picked it up, and I was so excited. I remember going back and starting to flip through the magazine. And now, that particular issue had a chart in it, a very lengthy chart that went over several pages that captured my attention. And, what it was an overview, country by country, of what they were describing as basically communist influence.
Exactly. That was the scoreboard issue.
A scoreboard, yeah.
Right,
It was like, for example, they would say, of course, the Soviet Union had 100% communist influence in it, and maybe France had 40 or 50% communist influence or whatever. Well, naturally, as an American who was already tuned into the anti-communist movement, and obviously sympathetic to what I perceived to be the agenda of the Birch Society, I immediately turned to see how much communist influence they had in the United States. Now, this was this was in 1976, and as I recall, it was something like 80 to 90%. Again, this is off the top of my head. I don't have the magazine handy. I wish I did. But they had the United States listed as 80 to 90%, and I said to myself, well, yeah, this country is pretty liberal, and there is definitely a lot of communist influence, but that figure seemed, kind of extraordinarily high to me, but I said, well, this is their opinion. Well, then I started going down the list and looking at looking at other countries that were of interest to me, and at that time, and really today, I had a strong interest in Latin American political affairs, and actually was almost a Latin American studies major in college, but in later years. But in any case, so I started looking at the countries of Argentina and Chile. Now, that was in the time when those countries were in the hands of what were generally called right-wing military dictators, hardline anti-communist military men, et cetera, et cetera. That's how they were described in the mainstream media. In any case, but the Birch Society said that the communist influence in those two countries, which were generally known as very anti-communist, ranged somewhere from 70 to 90%. Now, I'm thinking, God, maybe I really don't know as much as I think I do, or maybe these people, maybe they're exaggerating things, or I didn't know what to think. But then I looked at the one country in the world where they said there was essentially virtually no communist influence. Now, this really threw me. They said the state of Israel had somewhere between, I don't know, Rick, the figures, it was like somewhere between 10 and 20% communist influence. Now, and I'm saying to myself, now, wait a minute. Wait, there's something wrong here. First of all, the state of Israel was a socialist economy then, just as it is now, funded by the the American taxpayers. It's a welfare state. And now, also, I mean, this is a historical fact, and even the Israelis who admit it themselves, many of the founders of Israel were communists or socialists from Russia, no
Bolsheviks.
Yeah, Bolsheviks. Now, later in history, there have been these high-level conflicts between Bolshevism and Zionism. But I mean, for all intents and purposes, Israel historically, by virtue of the nature of its economy, its culture, everything about it, the kibbutz system, etc., Israel was a communist state. And on top of it, at that time, as I recall, there was only one communist party anywhere in any country of the Middle East of any substance, and that was in Israel. So here's the Birch Society saying that that Israel was virtually the least communist country in the world. Now,
so that rubbed you the wrong way.
Well, I mean, I had already done enough reading that I realized there was a lot of funny business at work in the Middle East as a consequence of the intrigue of the Israelis, and I also knew, in fact, that at various times in history, the Israelis had actually been Israeli agents were supplying information to the Soviet communists and so forth, and this is years ago, long before Israel got us dragged into this war in Iraq. But I mean, this is like 1976. So I'm saying to myself, oh my God, the John Birch Society has a really interesting, really skewed viewpoint. And this is when I was just beginning to investigate on my own the role of Zionism and so forth, but at the time, I immediately said to myself, I don't think the John Birch Society is for me. So that's why I called this article, my 1-minute membership in the John Birch Society because I was about to join the John Birch Society until I saw that article in the first publication of theirs that I ever read.
Yes.
Now, for the record, I have to say that over the years, I bought a number of publications from the John Birch Society. I bought a number of articles of theirs that they published in copies of American Opinion. I certainly read the Birch publication there in the library, and found many informative things in it. And
all right, let me hold you there, Mike. Let me hold you there, because I see the clock ticking. We got our break. When we come back, we'll resume this interesting historical adventure. And, folk, you're welcome to join in on any time. 800-313-9443. We're talking with Michael Collins Piper, correspondent with the AFP and the Barnes Review. I'm Rick Adams. Radio Avenger will return.
The first step in winning the war, spreading the word. Tell your friends Rick Adams is on rbnlive.com.
Yes, we're back. And again, Mike Collins Piper, our guest. He's giving us a little synopsis of his rather rapid journey through the annals of the John Birch Society in the mid-'70s. And Mike, continue. What were you saying?
Well, okay, I just want to say, first of all, before I proceed, yes, of course, I was a 16-year-old kid at the time. But I think I was a pretty smart kid. At least my teachers always said so. They didn't necessarily like me because of my political views. In fact, one time I had a teacher trying to defame me by saying that I was a member of the John Birch Society, although he obviously didn't know that I never joined. But this same teacher also called me a flag-waving super patriot.
Well, that's a compliment.
Well, that is a compliment, and I still consider myself a flag-waving super patriot, although I don't think President Bush and his warmongering colleagues think I am.
Well, I mean, after all, look at the flag they're waving.
Yeah, exactly. That's
it's certainly the UN, John Bolton, and the Israeli flag, and of course, it's they're anything but they're patriots for America. So anyway, you should consider yourself to be happy.
So Rick, I went on there. It was like the next several years. I went on and finished up high school and went into college, and then I went to work for Liberty Lobby because I realized that Liberty Lobby was far more along the lines of what I believed about what was good for America than what the John Birch Society believed. And frankly, because Liberty Lobby was very critical of U.S. policy towards Israel, that was my chief attraction to Liberty Lobby. So when I got to Liberty Lobby, I was so delighted to discover the Liberty Lobby had a wonderful research library, thousands and thousands of news clippings and letters and correspondence and all sorts of material from all sorts of different points of view and places and people and things. And one of the substantial files was a file on the John Birch Society. And what I discovered was that those files were filled with letters and correspondence from people who had had a similar journey through the John Birch Society, just like I had. And I started discovering that there were some pretty well-known names who had either resigned from the John Birch Society or actually had
were forced out,
or were kicked out of the John Birch Society. Interestingly enough, for the very specific reason that these people had dared to criticize Israel. Now, at this juncture, again, I don't want anybody who is listening to think that I am strictly criticizing the John Birch Society for its position on Israel, because as you'll see, we'll find there's some other very controversial positions that the Birch Society has taken. So if anybody out there thinks this is just a bash Israel and bash JBS because the Birch Society is pro-Israel, that's not the case at all. But having been said, let me continue.
Sure.
In these files, I found all these letters, plus I got to know Willis Carto, the founder of Liberty Lobby, who had been at one point one of the Birch Society's leading organizers out in the field. Well, he left the Birch Society because of that particular issue and because of what he observed going on inside. And the editor of the Spotlight, Vince Ryan. Vince had actually worked in the national headquarters of the John Birch Society in Belmont, Massachusetts for several years, and certainly was an insider by any estimates. And Vince, of course, had been active had been a member of the Birch Society, had been active in the academic world at a time when a lot of conservatives, academics and college professors, were afraid to stick their necks out. So both these guys, were long-standing patriots, for want of a better way of describing it, and they told me their own personal stories. And I read about Revel P. Oliver, who in his day was one of the great figures of the John Birch Society, one of the most popular speakers, one of their most popular writers. He, too, left the Birch Society in disgust because of what he was seeing within. So immediately I started to think, there's something wrong here. I mean, I know what I said was, well, I was right. The musings of a 16-year-old boy were basically confirmed in thousands of pages of letters and published documents.
All right. Yeah.
I'll tell you what really threw me, though.
Okay.
And that's when I found out about the Rockefeller connection to the John Birch Society.
Wow.
Now,
that is the most incredible thing that anyone could discover about this supposedly anti-Rockefeller group.
Right. This is why, now bear in mind, in this context, that when the John Birch Society first emerged, I think it was the details escape me, but as I recall, it was in the mid to late 1950s. But then after a period of several years, the national media suddenly began promoting the John Birch Society, saying that it was this terrible, dangerous, conservative organization. In effect, giving it a vast amount of publicity and essentially directing millions of American conservatives, in the direction of the John Birch Society. And as a consequence of all that media publicity, the John Birch Society's income skyrocketed. They had units all over the country. And another very important point to keep in mind is that even though there were units all over the country, they were essentially tightly controlled from the highest level.
And Mr. Welch did make that very clear from the beginning. It was a monolithic organization.
Exactly. It was tightly run.
Stay tuned now, Mike. We got another break. I apologize, but we got to pay the bills.
Got to pay the bills.
And we'll be right back with Mike Collins Piper and Dan from Oregon and you on Uncensored Radio Free America here on RBNLive.com. I'm Rick Adams.
Get back at him with Rick Adams, the Radio Avenger on the Republic Broadcasting Network.
By some awful quirk of fate, the Morlocks had become the masters and the Eloi their servants. The Morlocks maintained them and bred them like cattle.
And welcome back, fellow cattle in America today. All right, we are the slaves, and they are the masters. All right, we're back with Mike Collins Piper, a very prolific writer, author of many books, and with the American Free Press, also a contributor to the Barnes Review publication. I'm Rick Adams, Radio Avenger, and we will get to you, Dan, in Oregon, and others. I promise you. Just want to let Mike finish his little synopsis here, and we'll get it right on. We'll take your calls, and the controversy will begin. Okay, Mike, as you were saying.
Okay, well, in any case, going through these massive files at Liberty Lobby, and I was greatly fascinated to do it, I found something which summarized it all in my mind as to precisely what was up. There was a gentleman who operated out of Washington, D.C. many, many years ago. He's now deceased. He published a little publication called Capsule News. Capsule, C-A-P-S-U-L-E, like a pill, a capsule. Capsule News. And his name was Morris Bell, and his last name was spelled B-E-A-L-L-E. Now, I believe his name may have been pronounced Beal. At this point, I can't remember, but the last name was spelled B-E-A-L-L-E. And in the August 1965 edition of Capsule News, he said flat out, he said, Robert Welch and his brother Jimmy received a tremendous payoff from the House of Rockefeller 2 years ago, that would have been in 1963, for organizing the John Birch Society. The total payoff was $10,800,000. Says on October 1st, 1963, Rockefeller-controlled National Biscuit Company announced the purchase of the James O. Welch Candy Company of Cambridge, Massachusetts. That the family business of
Robert Welch, right,
the founder of the John Birch Society. Now, he goes on citing some details from Moody's Manual of Industrials, Standard & Poor's, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, what he goes on to say is that the Welch Candy Company, for everything that it had, was worth really no more than about $200,000. But the Welch brothers got $10,800,000. Now, that's a pretty good profit. Now, what makes it interesting, as Mr. Bell or Mr. Beal points out, is that, Robert Welch would deny that the National Biscuit Company had anything to do with the Rockefellers or Rockefeller sphere of influence. But the point is this, that two of the directors of the National Biscuit Company were a guy by the name of Roy Tomlinson and Don Mitchell, who were members of the Rockefeller-controlled Council on Foreign Relations. And Tomlinson himself was a director of Prudential Life and American Sugar Refining. And, it's kind of interesting because, as Bell pointed out, American Sugar was a company that made a deal with Fidel Castro that basically helped set up Fidel Castro. Now, you might say, oh, well, this is a tenuous connection, but I don't know about that. When you find that the Rockefeller family and their associates basically put nearly $11 million in the hands of Robert Welch, who was supposedly a critic of the Rockefellers and their deals with the Soviet Union over the years, you have to wonder what was really going on. Now, the thing is, Bell was not the only person to say this. As distinguished an American populist historian as Eustace Mullins.
Yeah, who's been on the show quite regularly.
Yeah, Eustace actually talked about this publicly in a number of venues over the years, So that, to me, was a real tip-off about why Robert Welch had suddenly got all this publicity in this mainstream media, and it's been a known fact for years that the Rockefellers and their corporate associates have had a major controlling influence in the American media. So if they really wanted to set up a phony opposition organization, that would be the way to do it. That's exactly how the old Soviets did it with an operation called the Trust, where they actually created an anti-communist movement.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
To bring people in so they could keep track of them and know who they were.
Exactly.
And, I'll tell you what, as far as I'm concerned, Eustace Mullins has put his imprimatur on it, and certainly Morris Bell, who was an interesting writer, he laid this whole scenario out. And incidentally, just for the record, it's kind of funny, Morris Bell, he can't, let's put it this way, Morris Bell was actually a critic of Liberty Lobby and of Willis Carto, the founder of Liberty Lobby. Now, I have to point out that he was not a critic of Willis by suggesting that Willis and Liberty Lobby were agents of the Rockefellers. He was mad at Willis and Liberty Lobby because they didn't do a second printing of a book that Bell had put out and that Liberty Lobby had published for him. So he had a personal gripe with Willis Carto. But on an international political level, he was raising very serious concerns about who was funding Robert Welch and the John Birch Society and why.
Now, when you take all these little factors together, and most telling that Robert Welch considered anybody, virtually, who tried to bring up important issues and ask for a clarification, a neutralizer, as it were, or an agent provocateur, that sort of raised a lot of people's shackles, and it raised my eyebrows a little bit, too, later on, a little bit later than you, I might add, but not too long after that, in the 80s, when, we started asking these questions and saying, hey, wait a minute now, how come the John Birch Society will not allow for enough criticism of Zionism and the State of Israel to be consistent with its own freedom philosophy? I mean, if you're for freedom and you're for anti-communism, and you certainly are against globalism and internationalism, why would you allow neutrality, quote-unquote, with regard to the mini-state in the Middle East? So,
well, Rick, let me tell you something else, and again, I want to emphasize this, and I don't think you feel this way either. I'm not here just to talk about the Birch Society on the issue of Israel.
No.
Let me give you, before we go to some callers, let me give you another example, which was a real shocker to me because I had always just kind of assumed that the John Birch Society had the same concerns about the Federal Reserve System. Now, I think probably most of your listeners who've ever done any reading on the Federal Reserve recognize that basically it's a privately controlled banking monopoly which masquerades as a public institution. The only thing public about it is the fact that there's a so-called board of governors appointed by the president. But, you know, and as probably said on this show and people know, if you actually look the Federal Reserve System up in the Washington, D.C. telephone book, it's in the business section. It's not in the government blue pages. But here's what the John Birch Society, one of the John Birch Society's favorite economists, Hans Senholz, wrote about the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, and I know him very well, Dr. Senholz.
Okay.
Go ahead.
He wrote this in the September 1964 issue of American Opinion about the funny money Federal Reserve System. He says, the control rests absolutely and undividedly in the hands of the U.S. president. They, the people who run the Federal Reserve, are agents of the government, not corporate officials with the proprietorship rights and powers customarily as stockholders of corporations. The Federal Reserve System is not, nor has it ever been, a quote-unquote private banking institution that is busily filling the pockets of the bankers, nor is it the evil product of an international conspiracy of foreign bankers. Now, as I point out in my article, Norbert Murray, who was a patriot, who was a career journalist, and he'd actually been a publicist for a lot of New York-based, he was a New York publicist for a lot of major businesses, including Dunn's Review, the famous stock report. He described that article as a pack of lies that protected the fraud of the system. Now, I'm here to tell you that in 1964, back when a lot of good patriots were getting involved in the John Birch Society. And
the Goldwater campaign and all that.
Goldwater campaign, et cetera. The Birch Society was promoting the idea that the Rockefellers and their international allies had nothing to do with the control of the Federal Reserve System. Now, that's a lie.
And yet, if I'm not mistaken, we go to the 70s when I came into the Birch Society, and you had writers, of course, Susan Huck and a number of others, George Schuyler and so forth, who were writing quite a bit, including Gary Allen and people like that, none dare call it conspiracy, writing quite copiously against the Rockefeller connection to everything, including the CIA. So how does that jive then?
Yeah, this is something that I'm unable to explain simply because I am unable to explain it. On the other hand, though, let's face it, as I said earlier, in the old Soviet trust model, some of the most outspoken anti-communist people in the world were being financed and subsidized by the Soviet intelligence service.
Well, it's interesting you should say that because if you read, I think it was Benjamin Gitlow who wrote the book, and he wrote the book on, wait a minute, it wasn't him, it was someone else, on I Was an NKVD Agent. You probably recall that book.
I've heard of it, I've never read it.
And the author exposed the fact that in the Soviet Union, the master spies would prepare and send out to the West, their junior spies, and they would tell them exactly what you just said, to pretend to be anti-communist to gain credibility. In fact, they said, you attack the Soviet Union all you want, the more, the better. But one thing, the master spy said, you don't do, or we'll come and get you, and that is, do not contradict the thoughts of Marxism, Leninism, because when you do, we'll come after you. Now, you see, that's a very key point. You can denounce communism, you can denounce the Soviet Union, you can denounce the Red Brigades and so forth, but don't you contradict the basic underpinnings of communism, because then you'll be waking people up, and when you do, that'll be the end of your life. That's a very interesting statement, and you see that practicality applied in many cases today. The same thing is true with the ADL and other hate groups. They say, we don't mind being attacked. In fact, we love being attacked. We don't want to be respected. We want to be feared. And that's exactly the same operating premise involved in many of these other strategists. You see, Mike?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And, another thing, too, back towards the 1970s and the late 70s and early 80s, it's important to keep in point that I forget what year exactly Robert Welch died.
Yeah, it was not too many years ago, but significant number of years ago.
Yeah,
it was in the 80s.
Yeah, but prior to that, for a period of about 10 years, there was a guy, John Reese, who came into the John Birch Society.
Yeah, he was writing in the Review of the News at that time.
Yes, and
I remember you doing some exposés on him.
Yeah, John Reese was an intelligence agent with multiple connections going all different ways. British intelligence, Israeli intelligence.
Yes.
He became the power behind the throne in the John Birch Society, and he was essentially the man who was running things, and that is precisely at the time when the John Birch Society, in previous years, the Birch Society had very little to say about the U.S. role in the Middle East. And largely took a hands-off position at the same time they were kicking people out who were making statements. Now, let me clarify that. Yeah. What I'm saying is that in its publications, the Birch Society stayed away from the Middle East issue for the most part. But those people who did dare to take it on within the organization were kicked out. However, under the rulership of John Reese, that's when the Birch Society became suddenly quite pro-Zionist, to the point that I recall seeing, and I even have a copy of it around here somewhere, the Birch Society published a glowing front-page story about Richard Pearl, now one of the leaders of the High Priests of War inside the Bush circles, promoting this particular point of view that Richard Pearl was best known for. And I hasten to add that there were a lot of people who pointed out that Richard Pearl was not necessarily anti-communist per se, but he was more anti-Soviet. So in other words, what you had a very subtle shift in philosophy there.
And this is a time, now don't forget, from the 70s on, when you had the neoconservative movement infiltrating a lot of different aspects of the spectrum.
Absolutely.
The right, the left, and so forth. And you had the conservative Zionists, kosher Zionists like Midge Decter and Norm Potteritz.
They were all promoted in the Birch. They were all promoted in Review of the News during those periods.
Exactly.
I remember Midge Decter. I remember Norman Potteritz. Exactly.
So Commentary Magazine, and now, of course, you read their other publications that they have, and they attract people who they set their sights on. For instance, they look at a guy who was at the Journal Bulletin in Rhode Island, someone that was Philip Terzian, very strong anti-communist and to a large extent anti-Zionist individual. Well, I noticed in recent months that his columns started getting more and more apologetic and more appeasatory, if you will, to Ariel Sharon, giving Ariel Sharon credit for making some bold initiatives for peace and so forth. So I said, something's coming up here. Sure enough, he wound up invited to be a member of the staff of one of the prestigious Jewish publications. And so it's interesting to see how they follow people in the media for intellect, and then they try to wean them into their own grasps. And this is what they've done at a number of publications, you see.
Incidentally, I probably just should mention it for the record, I recall also that the Birch Society put out I don't know what it was called, a white paper on Liberty Lobby or something like that.
A white paper, yeah.
Yeah, something like that. And one of the chief criticisms they had of Liberty Lobby was that Liberty Lobby had said nice things about the Palestinian Liberation Organization.
Yeah.
And the whole Birch argument was, and it remains the Birch argument to this day, I've seen it in Birch publications, the idea that the PLO was a communist outfit supported by the Soviets. And I'm here to tell you, that is just absolutely not true. In fact, the foundation for that horrendous lie came from a book, a very spurious, fraudulent book written by Claire Sterling, who has been a pro-Israel propagandist for I think she's dead now, but but she put out a book years ago that was a forerunner of a lot of the neoconservative propaganda today. The PLO was dominated by anti-communist and anti-Soviet elements.
It's interesting you should say that, okay? And by the way, I'm sorry for you on the line. Stay with us. I promise you we'll be back.
Yeah, I'll cut it off.
All right, let me just come back and just say one thing based on that, and then we'll get right to our callers. Rick Adams and Mike Collins Piper. We'll be right back. Listen, how do you put a guy like Rick Adams on the air? He's insulting. He's terrible. He's attacking the people that make us happy. He's not one of us. He's not an American. He's nothing but a rabble-rouser. Well, thank you. We are back now on the Republic Broadcasting Network. A little bit later on, we'll tell you how you can continue to help us through this pledge drive. But right now, we've got Mike Collins Piper from the American Free Press, and who has written this article in the current issue of the Barnes Review. And, of course, he's dealing with his very brief 1 minute, shall we say, if you will, membership in the John Birch Society. Just to buttress one of the things that you said, Mike, in the Dan Smoot report, Dan Smoot was a former FBI official who resigned, took a leave, and, of course, started his own educational ministries in the 1960s. The Dan Smoot report for October 19th, 1970, had an article entitled U.S. Captive of Zionism. And in it, he refers to Truman. In Truman's memoirs, reveals his resentment of Zionists for intense pressures they put on him to support their machinations in Palestine, but he claims he acted not in response to their demand, but out of compassion for Jewish refugees in Europe who did not want to return to their nations of origin. Truman's compassion for homeless European Jewish refugees made homeless refugees of a roughly equivalent number of Palestinian Arabs, but Truman expressed no compassion for the Arabs, whose misery he helped to cause was worse than that of the Jews whom he had succored. And then he goes on to state, with Machiavellian shrewdness and cynicism, communists have taken advantage of the situation with Truman and the Zionists created in the Middle East. Prior to 1948, the Arab world was generally pro-American, anti-Soviet. Now, Arabs became pro-Soviet, and they hate the United States more intensely than ever. They dislike the Soviets. Old Arab antipathy to the Soviets rested in part on Arab repugnance to the Soviets' atheism. Although Arab states like Israel have adopted a subtle form of communism called socialism, undisguised communism is distasteful to most Arabs because it is openly atheistic. Now, that buttresses what you've just said.
Yeah, just to add as just a quick note there, although that's what, it's kind of interesting. That's what Truman wrote in his published memoirs.
Yes.
But in his private diaries that were only released just a year or so ago, he kind of told the real truth. And it turned out he didn't really have as friendly views towards Israel and its supporters, as he said publicly. So.
Well, after he recognized them to get the votes in the Electoral College, of course, he was threatened by the Zionist terror gangs, and they did send him poison, I believe, in the mail.
Yes, indeed, yeah.
So, this certainly has a way of scaring some people. All right, let's do this. Let's
go to the callers.
Well, we've got a bunch of people, and I want more to get on the lines right now. We've got a couple of lines available for you. 800-313-9443 is our number. We only have a half minute before the hour break. I promise you, when we come back, we will take your calls and give you a good amount of time to speak with Michael
Rick, I think that's
Piper.
very important.
Absolutely. We'll do that in just about 1 minute and 20 seconds, but we have the break, and I don't want to give you a chance to start talking and then cut you off. Okay, Dan and Kevin and others, 800-313-9443. This is Uncensored Radio Free America, telling it the way you wish you could, and you can, by joining us. I'm Rick Adams, and I and Mike Piper will be back with hour number 2 of tonight's fascinating program. Don't miss it.
The Radio Adventure. Let's keep it Live, uncensored. Radio Free America. Another exciting, informative hour is warming up. Rick Adams is on fire.
Yes, we are, and thank you for joining us tonight. Mike Collins Piper, our guest, and we're going to go right to the phones right now. Dan in Oregon, sorry for the wait, but you're welcome aboard.
Thank you very much. I had a similar experience with Mr. Piper. In the old days, when I was required to take civics in high school, I had to do a paper on the John Birch Society, and this was in 1961. I sent them a letter, or I called them, and I got a call from the president of the chapter in the area of Massachusetts I'm from. And he was explaining to me about the John Birch Society and what it stood for. I think, like your guest speaker was talking about the 70s and 80s, but I believe in the 60s why the John Birch Society became very popular because they were more domestic in their approach and drive. Like, for example, I'm not quite sure, but I believe that they were the ones who started the campaign to impeach Earl Warren.
Yes, they were. Yeah.
And then also I think I found this a little bit hard, but, another thing that they had was they accused Eisenhower of being a communist agent.
Well, he didn't really say that. See, that was what Eisenhower's people were saying. I think what Robert Welch said in his book, The Politician, was that Eisenhower followed a platform which implemented much of what the communists wanted domestically as well as in foreign policy. Not saying that Eisenhower was a member, but that he was far more dangerous than being a member of the Communist Party because he was above all of that, and those that controlled him were guiding that administration. All you had to do is look at the communists in Hungary, look at in Cuba. All of these countries went communist or stayed communist because of Eisenhower, not to mention his role in World War II. But, Mike, go ahead. You want to respond to that, too?
Well, actually, I kind of see exactly what's your name, Dan, is coming from.
Dan, yep.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that he brings up the impeach Earl Warren thing.
Yeah.
A lot of people I know, and as I say, I know a lot of people who've been in key positions in the Birch Society, in Belmont, and all over the country. A lot of them came to the conclusion, perhaps early on, that was an impossibility. And frankly, from a historical standpoint, the idea of impeaching a Supreme Court Chief Justice was pretty impractical, and yet thousands of good patriots all across the country spun their wheels for several years in that project, one that really could not have succeeded. So that was another complaint that a lot of people had about the John Birch Society, that some of the projects that they were put into were projects that had no real hope of succeeding in anything, and were just designed to keep people busy and keep them
chasing after various ghosts and so forth.
Yeah, somebody once said that the John Birch Society was kind of like a conspiracy to promote books, and I thought that was kind of interesting. But
Mr. Piper?
Yes.
Yeah, another avenue I'd like to take is that since I am originally from Massachusetts, and of course eating enough of Welch's candy bars being young, especially Walico candy bars, I guess, in a way I agree, in a way I disagree with Welch being the total head. I mean, the group that formed the John Birch Society were equally important in giving the money to get it going. Like, for example, if I remember correctly.
Can you stay with me on the break, Dan?
Sure.
All right, hold that thought because I see the clock ticking again. Let's take this break on the network, and you and Mike Collins Piper and I and the rest of us will be right back with more talk about the John Birch Society. Is it real? Is it not? When we continue, and what do you think of this whole controversy? I'm Rick Adams. We'll be back.
Rick Adams is back. Live, uncensored Radio Free America continues on the Republic Broadcasting Network.
What kind of government rules your world? We have no government.
Well, we certainly have a lot here today, that's for sure. And we're back now with Dan from Oregon on the program. 800-313-9443 is our number. Michael Collins Piper. Dan, you were making a point about the founding members of this council that joined Mr. Welch, I guess, on that day when they all got together. Was it in Indianapolis?
I don't remember when.
I think so. Mike, you might remember.
I think you're right about that. I believe it was Indianapolis.
And that was like, what, 1959, 1960, or somewhere around there?
I think 58.
58, yeah. And they had the blue book put out about the minutes of the meeting and so forth. But anyway, what was your point, Dan?
Well, the point was, I always went under the assumption that John Birch in the earlier days were ruled by a committee. You know, that the founders of the organization, like Goddard and Stoddard, there was the Telegram and Pratt Airline, Airpots, that Welch was the spokesman for the group, and they were the ones who really determined the direction and what they would do and would not do.
Mike?
You know, I'll tell you, I can't honestly comment on that specifically, but my memory, if my memory serves me correctly, I saw some in the Liberty Lobby files. I saw some analysis by some outside individual who may have been Helen Peters, who was pretty well known in her day. And she actually pointed out, to my surprise, that there were actually quite a few people among those founding members that he's talking about who joined with Welch. Whoever this source was, I believe it was Helen Peters, pointed out that a lot of them had very establishmentarian connections, which is not what could be said about the average good, patriotic John Birch Society member in America. However, I would add that despite the fact that there was this founding council, or whatever the name of the actual entity was, Robert Welch, as I understand it, notice I'm qualifying this very carefully, Robert Welch, as I understand it, was the guy who really ran things from the top. Where he was taking his orders from, God only knows. And,
By the way, I just, like I said, I can't fault him on this premise, and that is that he was saying right from the beginning, we are not a democracy. Democracy is evil. We don't want anything to do with it. We run the organization from the top down, and if you don't like it, don't join or get out. To that extent, he was absolutely right, in my opinion. I can't fault him for that.
In that regard, I mean, I have to say, it was his organization, so, hey, it's
sort of like
right
the Catholic Church,
it's his right to run it the way he wants to run it, but that also leaves all of us who have criticisms the right to do it. And, incidentally, the late Colonel Jim Braddock, who I was privileged to know for several years before he died, he wrote a book which unfortunately was never published, but I actually worked on it with him, not as a co-author, but we were working towards getting that book published. And as a consequence, I had the pleasure of reading it. And in that book, and Colonel Braddock was, he was a very, very famous American World War II fighter pilot, and later was in the airline industry and knew that inside. Now, that'll touch on another subject I'll talk about later. But in any case, Colonel Braddock detected a very distinct Freemasonic tone in a lot of Robert Welch's writings, and that's something that I'm not well versed in, but I thought that was very, very interesting that he pointed this out. So that's just another little thing to consider.
Mr. Piper, I have one more question and two quick comments, and I'll get off the line.
Yeah.
Okay. The next question is, and I really couldn't quite understand this when this was going on, is why was the move from Belmont to Orange County, California, done?
Well, I believe
it was Wisconsin. Appleton,
they're in Wisconsin, yeah.
But I thought it was originally they went to Orange County.
They had an office in California on the West Coast.
Okay.
Yeah, I think Dan is right. I think there may have been a preliminary move to Orange County, and then they relocated to Wisconsin.
Right.
I don't really know. I really don't know about that. Although I do recall that at one point, Bunker Hunt of the Texas Hunt oil family was evidently primary money bags behind the Birch Society, and that he may have had a part in that. That was after Robert Welch died. But I can't comment on that.
Okay,
I don't know.
What were your two comments? Quickly, Dan.
My two comments were this. I mean, for the listeners, number one, you might want to tell them how they got the name John Birch Society, and number two, after listening to Mr. Pfeiffer, it seems like there's an element of hypocrisy with the John Birch's model, which I always remembered since high school, and it was this. It's better to light the candle than curse the darkness. Apparently, they didn't want to light the candle from
Interesting point.
Okay, thank you very much, Dan. We'll let you go now. And go ahead. Did you want to answer both those comments?
Well, I thought that was an interesting comment. And as far as what was the other
John
thing?
Birch, the founder.
Oh, John Birch
the namesake of the founder.
Yeah, he was actually an American intelligence officer. He was in the OSS, and I'll tell you something. That in itself, to me, was always a little bit suspicious because the OSS was notoriously infiltrated by communists and by Zionist agents during World War II and in the years that followed prior to the time the CIA was established. So
he was killed in mainland China by the Chinese communists, right?
Yeah.
And he supposedly was a Christian minister, a Christian missionary.
Yeah, as I say, though, he supposedly was, so I don't know.
So you don't really know for sure, but anyway, that's what they've told us, and the book was written by Robert Welch. Okay, thank you for the call. Kevin in Ohio, you're on the program with Mike Piper.
Good evening, Rick. How are you?
Good,
How are
thank
you, Mike?
How are you doing tonight?
Good. Listen, just a couple things. In my readings, just to back up what you said, I have also come across many references to Robert Welch being a Mason. And traveling in Masonic circles.
Yes, okay.
And I've also read that Robert Welch had an open account at Chase Manhattan Bank to meet his payroll needs when required. Chase Manhattan being Rockefeller Bank,
Yes.
Something? It's funny you bring that up. I actually recall hearing that somewhere myself. The source on it, I couldn't tell you, but I have heard that.
Okay, but the point I like to make, Mike, is this, that when one studies this John Birch Society issue, one realizes that this was one very sophisticated fake opposition setup.
Absolutely.
That was a whole idea behind it. The whole idea, like you said, it diverted time, it diverted money, it diverted energy from going into productive work. So it was a very sophisticated operation. You think someone like Professor Oliver, he was a very, very shrewd, well-informed, sophisticated, intelligent man. And he was taken in by this for a couple of years.
Well, once he saw what was going on, he got the hell out, and he wrote in his book, I think the title was America, the Decline of the Conservatives. I forget the title of his book. I was just reading some excerpts from it this evening on the Internet. But in any case, he laid that all out about the John Birch Society.
No, but my point is that at first, though, he himself was taken in, I believe, for at least, 2 or 3 years.
Let's put it this way. A lot of good people were taken in. And, I'll tell you what, you have to bear in mind, too, that here we are sitting here in the beginning of the 21st century. And you know what? I'll tell you, at that time, America was still America and the American people were still very innocent. They were still, it was a completely different era. And, and Dr. Oliver, at that time, he was probably already in his late 50s, early 60s. So he was coming from another generation that really had not been exposed to all the intrigues and all these insane international dealings that we've seen in the last 25 to 40 years. So
of course, Mike. I don't mean to put down Professor Oliver in any way whatsoever.
Oh, no.
But my point is that just how slick the ruling class is in this country in setting up these fake fronts and these fake opposition.
Absolutely.
And they're doing it right now, too. They're doing it all the time.
Have you ever seen the website LeftGatekeepers.com?
Yes, I have, as a matter of fact. Yeah, that's a very interesting, if it's the one I think it is, it shows how a lot of these so-called progressive groups and so forth are actually being funded by the CIA and by high-level interests. Exactly.
It's a very, they have a chart on there. If you go to that website and you click the chart comes out to the whole page. And like you said, It talks about the Trilateral Commission, the CFR, and the CIA, and the Skull and Bones, and the Ford Foundation, and Carnegie Foundation, and Rockefeller Foundation, and their levels of influence and control over the left progressive media. It's all fake opposition.
Well, they create the dialectic, right, left, and then middle, and they orchestrate opposition to their own program so as to give them an advance. Pretty clever people when you think about it. And Satan is the ultimate mastermind behind it all.
Well, the other thing I like to mention is because of what happened with the John Birch Society, with so many good, decent people having their time, their money, their energy, talent diverted into useless avenues. Some people have pointed out the fake opposition currently going on in the so-called alternative media. People like Jeffrey Bennett of the Federal Observer and Clay Douglas before his motorcycle accident with his magazine, and Jackie Petru and Sweet Liberty with her program, and Victor and Lisa Giuliani. They have gone out of their way to write articles and bring attention to various fake and phony frauds in the alternative media, to make people aware of, hey, listen, be careful, be aware, be shrewd, because there's a lot of phonies out there who will take your time, your money, and your energy and get nowhere.
And,
Kevin, we got a break, though. Thanks for your call, brother.
All right.
Okay, yes, go ahead.
No, I'm just going to say, Victor and Lisa Giuliani at Wing TV are doing some great work on that. Jackie Petru, likewise. I'm familiar with what they're doing.
All right, let's be back in just a few moments with your calls. I'm Rick Adams.
Don't feel like the Lone Ranger. You've got the Radio Avenger on your side.
Hey, Rick Adams is on. Hey, turn your horse radio on. Rick Adams is on.
Okay, Radio Avenger is back again with his guest, Michael Collins Piper, who has written a few books, as a matter of fact. His most recent book on the New Jerusalem supersedes some other great books, including The Final Judgment on the Israeli Mossad link to the JFK assassination, and, of course, about the new neocon movement. And, Mike, you can mention those books if you want. People, in fact, are going to get a free copy of your latest book with a new subscription, I believe, right?
Yeah, they're giving away a free copy of
the New Jerusalem.
The High Priests of War. That is about these neoconservatives and their infiltration of the conservative movement in America, no less.
And the New America, the New Jerusalem, I believe, is your latest book, right?
Yes, that's doing very, very well. It's quite controversial, to say the least. It directly addresses the subject of Zionist wealth and power in America.
Very true. Okay, now let's take another call from Martin of California. Hello, Martin. You're on the program.
Hi, Rick. Hi, Michael. It's great to hear you. You're very informative. Just a breath of fresh air, and amidst all this confusion that I get to hear all the time. My story from, it parallels yours in some ways, except for maybe you were never in the position of being a left-wing anti-war protester back in the 60s like I was. But in the early 80s, my eyes were opened by the local American Opinion bookstore, and I remember reading Gary Allen's None Dare Call It Conspiracy and really connecting a few dots that I hadn't connected before. And, the whole idea of controlled opposition is something that I've only really started to realize lately, more this century.
Yes.
And, I wanted to kind of bring it up to date. I mean, you hear even on RBN here, you hear some people that I'm a little suspicious, let's put it this way, that they seem to have a certain bias. I mean, for instance, Phyllis Schlafly, who is with Eagle Forum, she has a connection with the John Birch Society, going back ways, I believe. And Stanley Monteith, he has a definite aversion to saying anything bad about Israel.
Well, now they've got this new group. I don't know if you've heard of it. Mike probably has. Speaking of Phyllis Schlafly, the Council for National Policy.
Yes, I have heard
and
of that.
they're bringing together people like Schlafly and Tim and Bev LaHaye and Concerned Women for America and Paul Weyrich and Robertson, Rushduni, Reconstructionists, people like that under one roof. And it's very interesting to see how this group, including the National Family Research Council and people like that who have Gary Bauer and so forth, are basically all coming together with the Rutherford Institute and other groups, basically even the Church of Scientology, on certain issues, and you really have to scratch your head and say, what is it they're doing? Why are they coalescing so much?
Well, that's interesting. As far as Phyllis Schlafly's concerned, she's done a lot of great work over the years on a lot of things.
She has,
but she's always been very studious, for want of a better word, to avoid the Zionist question. Although, ironically, my understanding is that she and her husband, who actually was a very outspoken, Fred Schlafly, he was very outspokenly anti-Zionist, at least in personal circles. They were good friends of Rebel O.P. Oliver, who we mentioned earlier. So, in fact, I had a friend who once attended a dinner party at the Schlafly home with Dr. Oliver and the Schlaflys, and I understand the primary topic of discussion during the entire dinner was Zionist power in America. But Phyllis has yet to write on that topic.
No, she doesn't want to lose a lot of her funding,
and I hate to bring something like that out, but I'm just telling it like
I understand.
It is.
Yeah, I wonder sometimes how much of it is a tactical maneuver on the part of these people, like you say, not to get funding or to avoid not getting funding, and to get some publicity, and how much of it really is controlled opposition.
Yeah, in some cases it's just precisely that, what you said. Some people just don't want to get into the issue, and hey, that's fine, and I understand that. But on the other hand, on the other hand, there are a lot of people who actually will go out of their way to attack those who attack Zionism.
The anti-Zionists, huh?
Yeah.
Well, I think Martin, I would say this, and that is, everybody can raise a question about anybody. All I know is the way I am on the air is what you see and what you get in person. And I know Mike, that's true of Mike and Willis and others that work for the American Free Press. And the thing is, you shall know them by their fruits. If they're telling the truth and they're not ashamed and they're not afraid of the truth, then chances are they're doing the work of the Lord. But if there's a little gray area and they're a little hesitant, watch out. Watch out.
I mean, that's always been my philosophy. I am prepared, anything that I write, I am prepared to defend it. I'm prepared to go on the air or go in a public forum. Sometimes I'm asked to defend things that other people have written or to attack them. I'm hard-pressed to do that if I don't have all the details.
That's right. You're right on the money.
If I have an opinion, I'll put it out there.
Sure. Thanks for your call, Martin. We'll be back with more calls if you want to get on the line now. 800-313-9443. We'll be back.
Well, the future's already there. It's irrevocable and cannot be changed.
Okay, we're back. Uncensored Radio Free America. 800-313-9443. Very controversial discussion tonight, as usual, on this program, on this great network. Mike Collins Piper. Let me just take a moment now to remind you, our listeners, that, as you know, we've fallen behind a little bit over the summer months, and John Statmiller, our great leader, has just come back and resumed his program today. And, of course, we want you to know that contributions, yes, have been coming in, but quite frankly, more is needed to fill the gap to pay off this enormous debt. And all of you listening to me right now who really value this forum and this network and this opportunity to speak out while we have time, while we still have freedom, to expose these evil forces taking down our country, from the Bush administration to what's going on overseas and so forth. Now's the time to contribute and help. Get on our site, rbnlive.com. Follow the little icon there of donations and pledge your support. You can do it through PayPal, through your credit card, whatever way you want. Pledge any donation that you can give. And if you'd like to call in and make a pledge during the daytime, you call 800-724-2719. That's 800-724-2719 with your contribution. I've sent mine in because I value this forum, and with the forces now that are working from the ADL and other groups to try to limit or indeed curtail and destroy all free speech altogether, these forces are very serious about this, and they're frightened to death that the Internet, talk shows, true alternative talk radio like this is going to be their destruction, and they are going to be destroyed in the end. So they're frightened, and we need to make them more frightened. We need to destroy them through the power of truth. And truth, you know, I know Mr. Welch used to say, truth is our only weapon. Well, we don't know what he meant by it, but I know what I mean by it, and I know what RBN means by it. So get on the horn and do something. Welcome back now. And, of course, Mike, there are many issues that are adjuncts to what we're talking about, and the fact that, you know, we have so many problems facing our great nation now. But one great patriot, who, of course, was killed, as you know, he was a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, was none other than Lawrence P. McDonald.
Glad you brought him up.
Lawrence Patton McDonald. And yes, indeed, I bring him up because I recall reading a few issues back in the Barnes Review a story essentially raising some even more frightening scenarios that when he was murdered by being on that flight 007, I believe, over the Sea of Japan, that he was specifically targeted, and the John Birch Society claimed that the Soviet Union deliberately targeted that plane because he was on it. And then this article in the Barnes Review raised another scenario. Will you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, as I say, I'm glad you brought that up because that's a perfect segue into something that I had actually referenced earlier. That was Colonel Jim Braddock.
Yes.
Excuse me. Mm-hmm. Colonel Jim Braddock wrote that article, and the article is important.
Right.
Or I should say Braddock's importance is such that it needs to be elaborated on. This guy was, as I say, a very, very famous fighter pilot for the United States during World War II. In fact, he was featured as the cover boy of the New York Times Magazine back during the war as kind of like the profile of the best kind of guy we could get out there.
The poster boy.
Yeah, poster boy. And Colonel Braddock, of course, later became a leading figure in the aviation industry and knew the military aircraft inside and out. And he was another, quote-unquote, graduate of the John Birch Society. And that article that appeared in the Barnes Review, in fact, I edited it to bring it into
to conform
space limitations.
To space, right.
That was an excerpt from his unpublished manuscript on the history of the John Birch Society. And it's interesting because Colonel Braddock brings out a very interesting point that a lot of John Birch Society members are not aware. And he was aware of this because he was in contact with a lot of former Birchers over the years, including some high-level people and key financial people. And the point is this: shortly before Larry McDonald's death, at which time he was serving as, I believe, the elected
National Council.
Yeah, he was president of the Birch Society. He was raising questions about things that were going on within the John Birch Society, and specifically about some financial matters, if I recall.
And now, also support for Israel.
Well, yes. Now, here's the thing. And, of course, he was going through an evolution, too, there. And he had actually been very, very close to this guy, John Reese, that I had mentioned earlier, and had him on his staff. But as I say, there were, he was beginning to raise questions. Well, and what's interesting is that although the Birch Society said for the longest time that that plane was shot down by the Soviets because Larry McDonald was on board,
right.
Colonel Braddock, who, as I say, is far more an expert in these matters than I am, he took a very close look at all the scenarios, and he concluded that that plane was not shot down under the circumstances that the Birch Society was claiming. That if anything, it was a standard shoot down that just happened to happen.
And bombs, I believe, were planted on it, possibly.
There was,
as well.
now there were some other questions too that were raised, and unfortunately, I don't have that article in front of me, so I can't comment on those particular details.
Yeah, I have it close by, but not in front of me either.
but needless to say, and I wish I had thought to pull that article up, But needless to say, the point is this, that even those who revere the memory of Congressman McDonald have to realize now, at least according to Colonel Braddock and his sources, that Congressman McDonald himself had some serious questions about the Birch Society. And
yes.
And so, again, things are not always as they seem.
Yeah, yeah. And,
just because someone wraps himself in the flag doesn't really mean that they believe in the flag. And that's what I'm afraid we had with Robert Welch and some of the things that he was doing.
And Larry McDonald had a perfect voting record, too.
Yes, he was a great guy. I didn't know him personally, but he had a great voting record.
He was true blue. I mean, there were others who tried to be like him, John Schmitz, and he had some problems and some baggage, as you know, and he's not with us anymore. But Larry McDonald was like the Ron Paul of Congress. He was true blue, and yeah, it's unfortunate what happened. And it's interesting that the Reagan administration totally ignored him on that plane like he never existed, and Ronald Reagan took it upon himself to deliberately and conspicuously not mention the congressman from Georgia on that plane. And
that's quite remarkable, considering the fact that he was a member of Congress. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, here was a so-called conservative Ronald Reagan, and here he was selling us down the river even on that, and that was the most tragic episode one can think of. Let's take some more calls, and that's an interesting article. People can look it up on the archives, and they can go back and read it, but it certainly is a stimulating one, and one that, needless to say, plants some unpleasant thoughts in one's mind. Okay, by the way, this is not to say that the John Birch Society has not done a great deal of good over the years, and that many of its members are true blue patriots, and we're some of them. We have
a guy on the staff of American Free Press who is a member of the John Birch Society.
Yep. Okay, let's go to the phone. 800-313-9443. John in Arkansas. Hello, you're on the program.
And greetings from the Jewish Zionist occupied stronghold of Little Rock, Arkansas.
Okay,
and trust me, they do occupy the sector.
Well, you're not alone, John. You're not alone. We're occupied here in Rogue Island, too.
Well, we have to fight this war. It's a Zionist Jewish plot. And for a long time, I've been running around here blaming the white man for all my problems. That was before I got self-aware, though. Now I know better. Much better.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to say this to your guest.
Sure.
Sir, Louis Kidd also said that some of those people that got shot down in that fight are still alive.
That's very, very interesting. And, I heard something about that at one point. I don't remember the details of it, but that is again, what it all comes down to. The way I look at this, and this is so common in a lot of things, that whatever we get from the national news media, I'm almost invariably inclined to say it's a lie. That's why independent radio like RBN is so important, because it gets so many alternative points of view out there and gives people a chance to get on the air and let literally millions of people hear things that they're not going to hear anywhere else.
And you can react to it right now as we speak. We allow this discourse to take place. They don't.
Yeah, and see,
they won't.
and just that particular story right there. I mean, for example, in American Free Press, for years we've been reporting stories about American POWs still being held overseas in various places
since World War II.
Yeah, and we're called conspiracy theorists and fearmongers and things like that. And for reporting all sorts of things that are suppressed by the establishment media. And I'll tell you, let me just comment on that. I don't mean to cut your guest off, but
go ahead.
I was sitting here listening to you make the appeal for funding for RBN, and then I look at people like Sean Hannity and Bill O'Reilly and Rush Limbaugh and Ann Coulter and Laura Ingraham, and they're supposed to be the quote-unquote the opposition to liberalism in this country, and they're supposed to be the vanguards of American patriotism, and yet they're the ones that get their books on the New York Times bestseller list. They're on 500 stations across the country. They have unlimited sources of income. And what they're doing is they are towing the Zionist line just as their promoters at the New York Times do.
I remember interviewing Gordon Liddy a few years ago, about 2.5, 3 years ago. And, Gordon Liddy is a guy I used to have a little bit of respect for until I interviewed him in his book about this was a free country when I was growing up. And when I brought up Israel, you should have heard him dance around Israel. And you should have heard him say, oh, no, Israel was attacked first, and Israel was always attacked. And it's like he's reading a script, which he was, that was placed in front of him, just as Hannity does, and just as O'Reilly does, and just as Rush does, and, of course, the ADL agent there, Michael Savage, and other shock jocks, They're all reading the same script. Hello. What in the world is that? That sounds like
a streetcar.
A streetcar. It sounds more like a Zionist air raid. My goodness.
Well, it's only been running about a month, about 8 months now.
Well, anyway, I put my 2 cents in. Go ahead, John.
I grew up by the railroad myself, so I know what that sounds like.
I want to say this. Don't even go there about the hand cultures. This week, Canada had troops in Vietnam. She lied on the CBC News about that Canada had troops in Vietnam. Mm-hmm. And the
I wouldn't
Huh?
And I was just going to be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised if she didn't tell the truth, because she doesn't tell the truth about a lot of things.
Well, the thing is, they all latch on to a little bit of truth, They'll latch on to Joe McCarthy was right, and this one was right, and that one was right, but they don't tell you the fact that these people, these patriots, were all in opposition to the very program they're pushing today, which is a police state, which is support for a foreign nation, Israel, and, of course, support for internationalism and globalism. These patriots, who were known as America Firsters, they were not the Ann Coulters of today. Believe me, not by a long shot.
Let me tell you something kind of interesting that I discovered quite recently, and I gather your caller is black from the way he introduced his comments.
100%.
100%. Well, all right. I'll tell you what I found out, something very, very interesting. Back in the 1960s, when the FBI had their agents inside the Ku Klux Klan, you know what the FBI would tell their infiltrators who were working inside the Klan? It's okay to get up and give speeches attacking blacks. It's okay to stir up anger against the blacks, but don't ever say anything critical of Israel or the Jews.
Oh.
Now, I found that very, very revealing because, over the years, I've started to take a close look at a lot of the agitation on both sides in this country over issues like the Confederate flag and on racial issues and stuff. And I've come to the conclusion that there are a lot of Judas goats. There's a lot of infiltrators in both sides who are deliberately trying to get people stirred up over issues like that when there are much big, like the Confederate flag, for example. Trying to get people stirred up on both sides of the controversy.
Exactly. Divide and conquer.
Getting blacks turned against whites and vice versa, and dividing the country even further within, because the only way to rule is by divide and conquer.
And yet, you notice what they'll do with regard to any group like the NAACP chapter in Texas a while back, where the head of the local group started questioning Israel and its policies. Immediately, the ADL went to attack him, and, of course, all the money started drying up until he resigned. So it's interesting to see how they use one race against another and pit them against each other and then sit back and let them fight it out, laughing all the way to the bank.
I have all the way to the bank. Thank you for stealing.
Well, I just want to say one thing before I go.
Yes, John.
I know you got other callers. But look here. We need more men like the late Congressman McDonald, and I'm sure Rick, you know about Leo Ryan. Now, those were real men and real representatives of our government.
Oh, yes.
You know what happened to him in Guyana? God, what are real men when we need them? Real representative, real congressman.
Absolutely.
Compared to what we got in that blankety blank house today.
Well, we had a good man in there a couple of years ago named Jim Trafficant, but he's sitting in a federal prison in Minnesota, framed for crimes he did not commit.
We can thank Mr. Chertoff for that, too. Huh?
That's exactly right.
National Intel Director, yeah.
Ain't they giving him the diesel therapy treatment?
Exactly.
Hey, Rick, I'm up on this stuff. You didn't think I knew that, did you?
I certainly did know that you know, because you're a very sharp man, John.
As an ex-con, I should know.
Yep. God bless you.
All right.
God bless you. Keep up the con. No, he went to jail, and of course for a while there, right, John? And I know that, as I said, nobody in your shoes goes to jail if it wasn't for the right crime. In other words, you do the time because you actually give us the truth. And you know, a lot of political prisoners today, there are political prisoners in jail just for that very thing. That's for committing the crime of political incorrectness. And if the ADL has its way with this hate crimes legislation, we may all be in jail someday and shipped over to Jerusalem and have our heads cut off, you know, with the new council, of course, as you know, Mike, what is coming there now, the revival of the Keenite establishment and the council that condemned Jesus. We're seeing all of this come back now, the Sanhedrin. And talk about religious fundamentalism and who's really threatening the world. All right, stay where you are. We'll be back with Joe next, and Rick Adams and Michael Collins Piper. Stay tuned.
Today, we're all going to learn a new term. It's only 2 words. Now listen closely. Can all of you say constructive fraud?
Constructive fraud!
And we are back now to wrap up tonight's fascinating and very quick-moving program with our guest, Mike Collins Piper, in this month's, this issue of the Barnes Review, B-A-R-N-E-S Review, and, of course, also correspondent in the American Free Press. We don't have any more time after the next caller, but we're going to have Mike back a little bit more regularly, Mike, because you're just a great source of inspiration for us.
Well, I've always had a lot of fun, and you got some real intelligent callers.
We have the best here, no question. Joe, you're on the program. Joe, our Bible guy. Hello there.
Hi, Rick. How are you?
Good, you.
I'd like to say hello to Mike, too.
Sure.
Good, Rick.
How you doing there?
Hi, Mike. Mike, I'd like to go to the scriptures if I could and bring out the Father's words.
Sure.
All right.
Do its work. Revelation chapter 13, verse 11. I beheld another beast. This would be a second beast in that chapter, coming up out of the earth. And he had 2 horns like a lamb. 2 horns like a lamb. You know, he looked almost like the Lamb of God. And he spake as a dragon. This was the impostor, Lucifer, and his company. This group, actually, if you go back to the 3rd verse of that chapter, and I saw one of his heads that were wounded to death, and the deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast.
Mm-hmm.
You see, this beast, this second beast, which is none other than a religious beast, actually comes up out of the earth, not the sea. And it healed the wound, the deadly wound to this world system.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see, and this would be a religious community.
Yes.
Daniel said in chapter 8:22, they would destroy wonderfully and come in peaceably.
Yeah, the so-called righteous.
Do you see this group starting to take form, a religious community of worldwide people coming into view now?
Well, that's very interesting. I was just watching some very interesting video materials last night talking about this very subject, and I will say this much, that although I've been active politically, as I say, since I was 16 years old, it probably wasn't until the last 5 or 10 years that I really began to realize that there is indeed a very spiritual element to all of this that we're talking about here today, you know. And it's a battle that has gone back to the beginning of time itself, and we're going to see more and more manifestations of this. We see these efforts of one world religion and the infiltration and destruction of the Christian religion from within.
Yep.
We see the manipulation of many millions of good Christians by false prophets.
Joe, does this sound familiar?
Sounds very familiar, Rick.
So yes, I guess that the short answer to a very difficult question about which millions of words are written is that I would say, well, not you're right, but the Bible's right.
There it is. There it is. Rick.
There you go.
Hey, it's just our ability to understand it. That's where the problem comes in.
Thanks for your call, Joe. Good way to end the program.
That was.
Thank you. And, Mike, it's been my pleasure again. We got to have you back in a couple of weeks or so.
Absolutely, Rick. Whenever you want,
Right.
give me a call.
Thank you. Godspeed to you. Bye-bye now.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. You can read Mike in this week's American Free Press. And I'm Rick Adams. Tomorrow night, God willing, we'll be back. Stay tuned to RBN. I'm Rick Adams. Good night, everyone.